Good morning, everyone. I'm Annika Harris, for those of you I haven't met yet. First, I just want to thank Philip for inviting me to speak at this fascinating conference. It truly is an honor to be presenting alongside of all of these brilliant philosophers and scientists. I also wanted to thank Andrei for all of the work that has gone into bringing us together this weekend, so thank you both. So I'm a science writer. I spent over a decade working with scientists to help make their work more accessible to the general public. So through editing and ghostwriting, coaching for talks for the general public. And then I wrote a book about consciousness that was published in 2019 called Conscious. And it was really through the process of writing that book that led me to believe that not only is this a legitimate scientific question, but it's actually a really important one. Is consciousness fundamental? And so I'm going to actually share the thought process that led me to become convinced that this is an important scientific question for any skeptics in the audience, and hopefully make a case for the subject of this conference. And then I'll talk a little bit about the documentary project that I'm currently working on the same subject. So first I'll begin by just getting as clear as possible about terminology and how I'm using the word consciousness in this context. It's probably unnecessary with this audience, but I still just think it's important to make sure that semantics aren't getting in the way of clear communication. So what I mean when I use the word consciousness in this context as something that I think is deeply mysterious and something that could potentially be fundamental, is simply the fact of felt experience. So not complex thought or self-awareness or higher order thought or anything complex like that. I like Thomas Nagel's description, if an organism is conscious, there's something that it's like to be that organism. So an example of a worm, we don't know whether worms are conscious or not, but it's not hard to imagine that there's a very minimal felt experience a worm might have moving through dirt, the sensation against its skin, or an impulse to move toward food or away from danger. And so I use the terms consciousness and experience, although I usually say felt experience, I think it's more accurate, interchangeably in this context. But the most accurate synonym I've actually found in terms of its definition is the word sentience. And it's not used that often in our culture, and people usually equate it with the word life, which I think can be confusing. But the definition reads, and the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition is feeling or sensation as distinguished from perception and thought, which I think is an important distinction. And then the Oxford English Dictionary uses in its definition susceptibility to sensation, which I really like because it leaves room for consciousness without content or prior to content, which we'll come back to that point later. And so the mystery is, of course, why any collection of matter in the universe, even brain processing, would feel like anything at all. Why, when a certain light wavelength enters the retina and is processed by the brain, an experience of blue materializes in the universe. We don't think a camera or a computer that also can process light waves and distinguish between different wavelengths of light has a felt experience associated with doing this. Plants can distinguish between different wavelengths of light, and these distinctions affect subsequent behavior, but we can imagine plants doing all of this without a felt experience. But for some reason, we and other systems like us do. And the central challenge to a science of consciousness is that we can never acquire direct evidence of conscious experiences apart from our own experiences. And so at least so far, we've had to rely solely on reportability. And this is true even within a single brain, as we'll get to when I touch more fully on split brain phenomena. But briefly, the work with split brain and locked-in patients, I think, should have radically shifted our reliance on reportability at this point, even for determining which brain processes are conscious and which aren't. If you ask a split brain patient what they're experiencing in that moment, you'll get the impression that none of the input to her right hemisphere is being consciously experienced, which we know is not the case. Similarly, we seem to be at least open to the fact that an unborn baby at some point in gestation would be having a conscious experience, however minimal, while residing in its mother's body, one that clearly can't be reported on by the mother. So how we can even begin to guess whether there's a felt experience associated with the processing of the kidneys, or what is considered by modern neuroscience to be unconscious brain processing, there are just too many areas we're not yet able to probe. And so far, all we have to go on is an analogy to where we find reports of conscious experience. And it's this inherent difficulty in studying consciousness that has led to what I call the strong assumption. I'm using this term because I think it has seemed to us, at least in the sciences, to be the most probable assumption, and I'm alluding to strong emergence with this term as well. So the strong assumption is the assumption that the sciences have made, and I include myself in this until somewhat recently, that consciousness arises out of complex processing, namely in brains. But as I hope I can show, we're not at all on solid footing when we make this assumption, and that it's actually a completely blind assumption. So ultimately, I would say that at this point, we really have to choose between two blind assumptions as our starting points in our scientific investigations. So in the broadest sense, when we look out at all of the organisms or collections of matter in the universe and ask ourselves, okay, which of these collections of matter contain or give rise to conscious experiences? Most broadly, the answer has to be some or all. The only thing we have direct evidence to support is that the answer isn't none, as we know that at least our own conscious experiences exist. And the sciences have thus far led with the assumption that the answer is some. And so have I, as I said, for most of my career, for, I think, understandable reasons. I'm glad we began with that assumption. I think it was the most fruitful path forward, given the limits to the science so far. But I would argue that the grounds for this starting assumption have actually become weaker as we learn more about the brain and have a better understanding of some of the false intuitions that we walk around with. Many of which have been exposed through modern neuroscience, through our understanding of processes like binding and memory. But we haven't really incorporated these findings into our intuitions yet. And we can see, I hope I'll be able to show, that these false intuitions are the main drivers for what I'm calling the strong assumption. So we'll get into the neuroscience in a little bit, but I first just want to take a moment to linger on the importance of challenging intuitions for the scientific process and to make scientific progress. It's the focus of my book and of much of my work relating to consciousness. So an intuition is simply the strong feeling that something is true, but it may or may not represent accurate information about the world. So many of our intuitions are incredibly accurate. We evolved them for good reason. In my book, I discuss the unconscious processing that goes on in dangerous situations. So we can get a feeling that something is wrong or that we're in a dangerous situation and not be aware of why. Of course, these gut instincts aren't magic. They're based on often subconscious processing. So when someone is adrenalized and about to act violently, their cheeks get flushed, their pupils are dilated. And these are clues that can be subconsciously processed, and we're kind of just left with this overriding feeling that we're afraid of this person. Similarly, people can notice objects in a room have shifted or a door has been left ajar. And again, these might not be consciously perceived, but the person is left with an overriding feeling that they're in a dangerous situation. So many intuitions are obviously very useful, and we evolved them for good reason, but many intuitions also give us false information about the world. And this is why challenging intuitions is such an important part of the scientific process and for philosophy as well, as we all know. We don't have great intuitions for the very small or the very large, or things that happen across long time scales. And so, all of the major scientific advancements, everything from understanding that the Earth is a sphere and not flat, as our intuitions would lead us to believe, to the germ theory of disease, to processes in nature like evolution that take place over vast stretches of time. We don't have great intuitions for them. And we seem to always go through this period of needing to adjust our intuitions when we get new scientific data or make big scientific breakthroughs. And sometimes it's a long period of time where we have to kind of keep checking against our intuitions and eventually shift them so that we're able to kind of let in and accept the new scientific data that's coming in. And I think we're at a point like that in consciousness studies right now. And so my suspicion that all of our scientific investigations of consciousness are unwittingly rooted in a blind assumption, what I'm referring to as the strong assumption, rather than on obvious facts, as it has seemed to us, led me to pose two questions that I think are essential for a science of consciousness to keep returning to in order to continue to probe our intuitions. So these two questions are related, but I think they're important to address separately. So the first is, can we find conclusive evidence of consciousness from outside a system? So in something like behavior. And the second is consciousness causal? Is it doing something? Is it driving our behavior in the ways that we feel it is? And our intuitive answers to these questions is a resounding yes. If I see my friend's face light up after I haven't seen her in many months at the airport, if I see my dog cry out in pain after stepping on something sharp, these seem like obvious evidence that these systems are conscious and inform our answer. Things like that inform our answer to number one. Likewise, it seems that the very feeling of fear or sadness or any other emotion or thought is the thing that drives our behavior in many circumstances. When I jump out of the way, if I see a car coming too quickly, it feels as though it's the feeling of fear that drives my behavior in that circumstance. And these types of examples inform our answer to number two. But we're going to look a little more closely at each of these to shake up our intuitions a bit. So, can we find conclusive evidence of consciousness from outside a system? First, I always like to point out that even if we found some behaviors that were evidence, we know that conscious experience can also exist without any external behavior. So in locked-in syndrome, when someone becomes paralyzed due to brain damage, but they retain full conscious awareness, and anesthesia awareness is, of course, another example. When a patient becomes conscious during a medical procedure, but they're still completely paralyzed due to the anesthesia. And these are important to keep in mind, that consciousness doesn't have to be expressed in behavior. But when we're looking for behaviors that we think would be the right kind of behavior, intuitively that might point to a conscious experience, things that suggest an organism is experiencing fear or pain, as I mentioned, we run into difficulty on that side because there are processes we witness in living systems that we don't think are conscious that can actually fit into a lot of these categories. So even many plant behaviors fit the categories of behaviors of conscious experiences you might call fear, hunger, even love in some circumstances. And it's easy for us to imagine those behaviors being unconscious when we witness them in plants. So we're going to look a little bit at plant behavior to shake up our intuitions here a bit. So the biologist Daniel Shamovitz, who I interviewed for my documentary series, he discovered in his research that not only are some plant behaviors analogous to human behaviors, but the analogy runs all the way down to the level of DNA. So the same set of genes that are responsible for a plant's ability to detect light and distinguish between different wavelengths of light is part of animal and human DNA as well. In animals, these same genes regulate responses to light and are involved in, of course, more complex but related processes for things like the timing of cell division and circadian rhythms. And there are a whole host of perceptions and behaviors among plants that are beyond mere reflexes. Plants don't respond to their environment in predetermined ways, but they make adjustments based on memory they've obtained from prior experiences, as well as new input from their ever-changing environment. They turn the direction of their leaves in anticipation of where the sun will be rising. They can time their pollen production according to when they know the pollinators are going to show up. They can distinguish self from non-self and stranger from kin. And they can warn other plants of dangerous pathogens or insects. So Paco Calvo, in his new book, explains how plants release volatile organic compounds with a lexicon. He reports that plants use more than 1,700, what he calls words, for warning each other about harmful pathogens, and that these communications happen within species as well as between species. And we're also learning more and more about mycorrhizal networks and how plants exchange information through them. So if you're not familiar, mycorrhizal networks are elaborate underground networks of fungi that connect individual plants and trees and transfer water, carbon, nitrogen, and other nutrients and minerals. And they provide these pathways for plants to communicate with one another. So Suzanne Simard is an ecologist who conducts research on intertree communication in mycorrhizal networks in the forests of British Columbia. I was lucky enough to be in the audience for this talk. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's very interesting. So she explains that the mycorrhizal web is so dense in these forests that there can be hundreds of miles of mycelium under a single footstep. And in her research, her team uncovered the fact that the Douglas fir and paper birch were involved in this two-way conversation and a reciprocal relationship. So the Douglas fir would send more carbon underground to the birch during the months when it needed it more, and vice versa. They also discovered that the trees were able to recognize which other trees in the forest had come from their own seedlings. And she refers to these as the mother trees. And it turns out that these mother trees send more carbon to their own kin than to the other trees they're connected to in the forest. And this is associated with increased seedling survival by 4 times. These mother trees also colonize their kin with bigger mycorrhizal networks underground. They even reduce their own root competition to make room for the roots of their kin. So someone tweeted this a few years ago. It's a slightly different image, but from the same Body Worlds exhibit of the nervous system. And the caption read in the tweet, "This would be conscious if it were alive." And I think I found this to be really powerful. I think it's interesting to contemplate that this is a system we know can produce conscious experiences, even when there are no obvious behavioral clues from the outside. So from the outside, we might not have any idea whether there's an internal experience being had in a system like this. So of course, just because these systems look similar doesn't mean they are. They're, of course, very different systems. But I think this is an important exercise in rattling our intuitions. The point is that from the outside, we just don't know whether there's an internal experience being had by either of these systems or by any system. So when we return to question number 1, can we find conclusive evidence of consciousness? I would say the answer to this is no. But at the very least, we don't have as clear an answer to this as our intuitions would lead us to believe. And then moving on to question number 2, is consciousness causal? So the truth is that even though we have a very strong intuition for this, we really don't have good reasons we can point to believe that the conscious feelings themselves are more motivating than the system or its programming. So we don't think that a self-driving car needs to love people in order to avoid harming them. We assume that the appropriate programming, don't harm people, more or less, will suffice. And the same goes for plants. We assume plants don't need conscious experiences to perform all the various behaviors that we witness, but for some reason we do. And I think observations like this give us reason to at least distrust our intuitions about if and how consciousness is causal. And modern neuroscience has given us, I think, many reasons to doubt our intuitive answer to number 2, because much of the functionality we ascribe to consciousness actually takes place in what are considered by modern neuroscience to be unconscious brain processes. And so there's some self-contradiction to be found here. So again, the feeling of fear is usually one of the first examples that intuitively feel like good evidence to us that conscious experiences are causal. I was recently debating a well-known philosopher at an Institute for Art and Ideas event. I won't name him, and the point is not to embarrass him. The point is that even someone who thinks a lot about these things can fall victim to this mistake. So he was arguing for the evolutionary usefulness of consciousness when encountering a bear, the fear response that someone would experience when encountering a bear, and that feeling the fear somehow provided an advantage to our ancestors. which of course it may have. But we know this is actually an example for the other side of the argument, because this type of fear response is considered to be subconscious. It happens prior to our conscious awareness. And the behavior gets triggered before our conscious awareness of the feeling of fear. It's an automatic physiological response. But our intuitions so strongly tell us that it's the feeling itself that's driving the behavior. It's easy to be misled here. And this is related to binding processes. So in my book, I say consciousness is often the last to know. It may always be the last to know. But in my book, I give the examples of playing tennis and playing piano to describe binding processes. So through binding processes, when you push a key down on the piano, you feel the note move down in the same moment that you see the note move down and you hear the sound of the note. Even though all of these signals actually take different amounts of time to reach the brain and then to get processed by the brain. I have a quote here from David Eagleman. He's a neuroscientist. You probably all know his work. He's a great science communicator, and he talks a lot about binding processes in his work. He says here, your brain collects up all of the information from the senses before it decides upon a story of what happens. The strange consequence of all of this is that you live in the past. Right? Like that quote. And so we're kind of tricked into thinking that we're experiencing the present moment when a lot has already taken place before our conscious experience. And now I'd like to just briefly touch on the phenomenon of the interpreter in split brain patients. I think it's informative here as well. So I'm sure you're all familiar with this phenomenon, but I'll just briefly review what's happening here. It can be easy to get confused. So this is a patient who's had his corpus callosum severed surgically for a treatment for epilepsy. Now making the communication between the two hemispheres of his brain, the communication is now impossible. He can't share information. So in this slide, he's in an experiment where they're showing him images on a screen, and he's asked to point to the card on the table that corresponds to the image that he sees. So his right visual field is being received by the left hemisphere, and his left hemisphere controls his right hand, and then the reverse is true. His left visual field is being received by the right hemisphere, and the right hemisphere controls the left hand. And it's true in most people, and it was true of this patient, of Michael Gazzaniga's. The left hemisphere is the speaking hemispheres where speech is processed. So when you ask this patient a question and you get an answer, a verbal answer, that is the coming from the left hemisphere. So in this case, his right hemisphere that's controlling his left hand is pointing to the shovel to indicate the connection to the snow scene, but his left hemisphere is not seeing the snow scene. So when you ask this patient, why are you pointing to the shovel? This is where the phenomenon of the interpreter comes in. The interpreter this is a term dubbed by Michael Gazzaniga, whereby it seems that an instantaneous response is generated that kind of gets delivered to conscious awareness. These patients don't feel as if they're confabulating. In this case, this patient said, you have to clean out the chicken shed with a shovel. And there are many examples of these that are very interesting, where, again, it's the patient doesn't feel as if they're confabulating. They really feel that this is the reason their body is behaving the way it is, even though, as you can see in this case, the left hemisphere has no awareness of the snow scene, and so it doesn't actually know why the left hand is pointing to the shovel. So the split brain research, I think, is informative in two areas. First, as far as reportability, we know that it's possible for there to be a conscious experience in a human brain that isn't necessarily capable of being reported on. So it exposes the problem of our assumptions about knowing about every conscious experience, even in our own brains. And then the phenomenon of the interpreter informs our intuitions about causality. So in the same way that binding processes expose the unconscious processes that take place prior to the conscious experience of things happening in one moment, the interpreter is an example of how our conscious explanation for our behavior, our feeling about why we've done something, can in some instances be generated outside of one's conscious awareness. Otherwise, these split brain patients, again, would feel as though they were confabulating rather than just feeling the feeling and feeling the thought that occurs to them. Or I should say that occurs to the left hemisphere in that moment. So I think all of this is informative when looking at these two questions and for shaking up our reflexive answers, our intuitive answers to these questions. And I would argue that it's the fact that we feel so confident answering yes to these questions that has led us to follow what I'm calling the strong assumption and conduct all of our scientific inquiry into consciousness by following the assumption that consciousness emerges at the level of brains, or at least some high level of information processing. And from there, all we've had to go on is the similarity or analogy to our own experiences. So we end up concluding that things that act like us are conscious and things that don't aren't. But the truth is that as we make progress in the sciences, in biology and plant behavior and neuroscience, we actually have less and less reason to respond yes to either question with any confidence. And if the answer to these questions is in fact no, especially number 2, which is entirely possible, we'll be forced to reconsider our jumping off point and consider the only option we're left with, which is that consciousness is fundamental in some sense. So again, these are the only options we currently have broadly for a starting assumption. And the important thing to note is that in either case, we're making a blind assumption because we really just don't know. So since we're such complex systems, and we seem to be the only things that are conscious in the universe, along with other animals and some other life forms, of course, we've assumed that consciousness arises out of complex processing. But what if complexity isn't required for consciousness at all? What if consciousness is very basic? Most scientific revolutions send us the same message, that we're actually not all that special in some of the ways that we've assumed. So we're not the center of the universe. It turns out we're made of the same atoms that rocks and stars are made of, and maybe there's nothing specific to being a human being or having a brain or a nervous system that gives rise to consciousness in the first place, that gives rise to felt experience. So rather than try to figure out how and where consciousness arises out of non-conscious matter, as we've been doing, if we follow the second assumption, that consciousness is fundamental, the scientists will have a very different project before them when it comes to studying consciousness. So where does this leave us? I would say this leaves us simply with a perfectly legitimate and fascinating scientific question, is consciousness fundamental? Even with the many advances in neuroscience over recent decades, the mysterious nature of consciousness has persisted, as you're all aware of. And this has caused more and more scientists and philosophers to wonder whether we've been thinking about the problem backward. So is it possible that consciousness is an intrinsic property of matter, or of something even deeper? And so panpsychism is, of course, the umbrella term we most often use for a view of the universe in which consciousness is considered to be a fundamental property. And while I think it's useful shorthand for this category of thought, and of course a lot of important thinking has been devoted to this question in philosophy in this category, I find it to be mostly problematic in my own work to use this term, especially when I'm talking to scientists within the sciences and when I'm talking to scientists and trying to create a bridge for conversation between neuroscientists and physicists and philosophers on this topic. And this is for a few reasons, and I think they're just important to keep in mind as this becomes more interdisciplinary. So I think it's problematic that panpsychism is an antiquated term that was coined in the 16th century, and so I think it naturally doesn't inspire confidence among scientists. It carries the further complication of being an ism, which implies a fully formed set of beliefs that someone could subscribe to, which I don't think we have yet. And unfortunately, I think it just sounds like a New Age word, and so it's aesthetically problematic. To many people, it just sounds pseudoscientific. And so I offer this as a suggestion to philosophers to use as needed. It's not always helpful or necessary, I think, to use this term when talking about the idea that consciousness is fundamental, and so just something to keep in mind. So in my own work and in discussions with scientists, I find it to be much more useful and clear and really inviting to simply pose what I think we should all be able to agree on at this point to be a legitimate scientific question. I also think that if panpsychism had never been formulated, if no one had ever come up with this idea before, I actually think it would be a question that would be naturally coming up for physicists right now. In particular, I think other sciences as well, but physicists in particular, especially right now as we're hitting all kinds of walls with the different interpretations of quantum mechanics and not moving forward the way that we'd hoped by now. And I think it's an even more legitimate question when most physicists now seem to believe at this point that space is emergent, and perhaps even time is as well, out of something more fundamental. And so there are many well-respected, brilliant physicists, such as Lee Smolin, who will be speaking tomorrow, who are now becoming interested in this question, which is exciting. We now know that the reality we experience as human beings through our perceptions is even more different from the underlying reality than we thought, including the fact that space itself is very likely emergent and not something that's fundamental. When space is one of the things we have such a deep intuition for, we thought it could be relied upon to be fundamental. Here I have a quote from the neuroscientist Anil Seth. His book is called Being You, and he really beautifully describes how the brain takes in the different perceptions from the external world and then delivers what he refers to as controlled hallucinations. So here he says, experiences of free will are perceptions, the flow of time is a perception, perhaps even the three-dimensional structure of our experienced world in the sense that the contents of perceptual experience are objectively real. These may be perceptions too. So I would say we're perceiving something about the structure of the universe when we experience space, but what that structure is of, we really don't understand at the level of physics, at the level of the fundamental. In the same way that seeing the color green is not a great indication of the underlying reality of the light waves and the brain processing, our experience of space is likely not a good representation of the underlying reality either. So one example from physics this might be similar to is the way in which we perceive the warping of space-time as the gravitational force. And the question would be, what might our perception of space-time itself actually represent at the fundamental level? There are many people thinking about this question, about how consciousness fits into our understanding of the fundamental physics, which is very exciting. There are two books here that are not out yet, one by George Musser and the other Adam Frank with his co-authors, and I spoke to both George and Adam for my documentary series as well. This is the title of my documentary series. This is what I'm now working on. So if we decide to move forward with this scientific question and start with a different assumption that consciousness is fundamental, what would this mean? So I'm trying to understand what this would mean for physics, if it would have any implications for the different interpretations of quantum mechanics, and how a new type of science might be able to study this question better. So if we look through the lens of consciousness as fundamental, there are three things I'm interested in exploring further and that I'm taking on in my documentary project. And I'll move through them briefly one at a time. So the first one is, does it help us better understand any theories in physics? The jury is certainly still out on this, but in my opinion, it actually makes some areas of mathematics and physics that currently seem utterly mysterious a little bit easier to grasp. And that doesn't mean it's correct, of course, but I think it's interesting and worth considering these areas. Other people have mentioned some of these areas as well. One example is the question about what exactly the laws of physics represent. Where did those laws come from, and do they exist independently of the physical manifestation of the universe itself, and how those laws play out? Some physicists and mathematicians, like Max Tegmark, believe that any shape or structure that comes out of the math isn't just theoretical, but must actually exist in nature. So if you take a 10-dimensional hypercube called a Decker-act, someone like Max Tegmark would say this structure actually exists in reality. And I would say it's impossible for us to understand what this really means at this point. But if the fundamental reality is consciousness, is felt experience, if it's all actually about felt experiences at bottom, then the math and the physics is a description of its structure. So if physicists like Tegmark are right, and if consciousness is fundamental, his view is actually much easier to swallow because we have an answer about what this is a structure of. And this is true for some elements of string theory and other interpretations of quantum mechanics. So the math and the physics would always be describing conscious experiences or qualia. And while there may be an infinite number of experiences we'll never have access to as human beings, we know about the fact of felt experience. It's the only thing we really know firsthand. We know what it means in a visceral sense and in a true sense. We know how it can take different shapes in the form of color or smell or more amorphous emotions. And we can understand that there are other qualia that we can't imagine, like sonar. And so we'd have an answer to what all of the math and the physics that we've developed so far is about. So the second thing I'm interested in exploring here is the combination problem in panpsychism. It's something I've spent a lot of time thinking about because of my interest in meditation and the types of insights that can be had regarding illusions using introspective practices. I see meditation as a scientific tool, the only one we have available to us currently for investigating our own moment-to-moment conscious experiences and for exposing some illusions that we walk around with. And one of the strongest and most consequential of these illusions is of being a self. So I'll touch on this briefly. First, I just want to explain what I'm not referring to when I talk about the illusion of self. The thing that's not an illusion is the fact of the phenomenon of human minds, or the healthy development and maintaining of what can be referred to as a self, along with an autobiographical story. So insofar as each of us is a phenomenon that can be that can be labeled in nature in the same way that we can refer to a cat or a tree or an ocean wave, but the truth is that the activity of the brain and its related experiences is much more analogous to an ocean wave than to a static object. So when we look out at the ocean, we can see the waves and perceive the waves and label them waves, while understanding that there's no real static thing that is a wave. The concept is useful shorthand for a dynamic phenomenon that occurs in nature. And the same is true of a human brain and mind and self. So the self I'm referring to that I am calling an illusion is the experience we all walk around with of being this single concrete entity that has a precise center or location somewhere in the head, the core of which is stable across time. It feels as if it's this static entity that claims ownership of my body, my brain, my thoughts even, that somehow stands outside of all of those things and is the thing that is doing the experiencing or thinking the thoughts. But we know that our conscious experiences are being generated by dynamic neuronal activity in each moment. It's analogous to an ocean wave in that the self is actually an endlessly fluctuating process rather than a static thing. And the combination problem dissolves when we can break through this illusion of self. Because the illusion goes all the way down to what I see as a mistaken view of what philosophers refer to as a subject, which I think is synonymous with this fundamental feeling of self that is an illusion. And so I believe this is yet another way in which a false intuition has been driving a false assumption. So this is one of the hardest illusions to talk about, and I don't have enough time to get to it fully today, but if you're interested in my view on this, you can find the paper I wrote for the special edition of Consciousness Studies that Philip edited, along with other articles I've written you can find on my website on this subject. But the punchline is that if there are no subjects, the combination problem actually kind of goes away. And in a universe where consciousness is fundamental and there are no subjects, all a universe essentially is at bottom is conscious experiences arising and passing away based on the structure of consciousness, which we have some way of understanding through our perceptions and through physics. So this isn't a perfect analogy, but I often use the analogy of a pot of boiling water to describe this picture, where consciousness is the water, it's pervasive, it's what everything is about. And the bubbles or the form or the structure give rise to the different qualia or content. And this is where kind of the element of consciousness without content or pure awareness can come in, where that's what the water would be representing, and then any form or shape it takes gives rise to the content or qualia. And then the third thing I'm interested in exploring is what a science that assumes consciousness is fundamental might look like. I think it begins with work that is in our current scientific framework. So work like Donald Hoffman's, he's one of the first scientists to conduct work based on the assumption that consciousness is fundamental with his conscious realism. Giulio Tononi and Christoph Koch with integrated information theory. There's assembly theory is something newer that I've been paying a lot of attention to. I just spoke with Sarah for my documentary series. This is a theory about life, not about consciousness, but I actually think there's a lot of overlap and probably has a lot to say on the subject. So these are all things that I think are beginning to pave the way. I think ultimately, if we're going to want experimental evidence, given the limits of reportability, I think it's going to have to be some type of experiential science. And I'm not sure if something like this is possible, but I've been thinking a lot about what this would look like. And it seems potentially tied to the sensory addition work by David Eagleman and others. So in my series, I interviewed one of the participants in a study that gave people an experience of magnetic north. They were actually able to manipulate the brain enough so that they gained a felt sensation of magnetic north. And I think there are interesting implications here for expanding the human Umwelt in a way that is potentially informative. I actually think the research into psychedelics could give insights as well. If anyone wants to talk about this later, I think there's some interesting experiments that could be done there. But the idea is that with some future scientific methods, we might be able to gain a tremendous amount of ground by experiencing other systems and forces that we don't naturally perceive, along with gaining new intuitions about them, which might be useful, or even sharing intuitions with each other. But the truth is that even if a pilot could gain an experience of the cockpit of the plane he's flying, which is something David Eagleman is talking about, or if we could gain, an intuitive feel of a redwood forest, that won't necessarily tell us whether there's a conscious experience associated with these things when they're not plugged into a brain, of course. We may always kind of be left with this mystery. But I still think we'd make a lot of scientific progress moving forward with this other assumption that consciousness is fundamental. In the same way we've made tremendous progress in neuroscience, assuming consciousness arises out of brain activity, I think this is a path that will inevitably lead to new and interesting and creative ways of thinking about consciousness, despite whatever its limitations might be. But this is definitely a project for the next generation. I'm really excited to see where all the new young scientists and students might take this. So again, these are some of the things I'm exploring in my documentary series, talking to physicists and neuroscientists and philosophers about what it would mean for consciousness to be fundamental, whether this is something that could even be squared with our current interpretations of quantum mechanics, and what implications, if any, it might have if it were true. So I've spent the last 3 years exploring these ideas and interviewing scientists, and hopefully in about a year or so I'll be able to release this. You can find more information about my work on my website and links to social media and that sort of thing. So thank you. Thanks for your time.